Part 5. This section of the training is specific to the financial services sector. Trafficking is a high-value business for criminals because unlike drugs that can be usually only sold one time, a human being can be sold repeatedly over an extended period of time. Trafficking is also attractive to criminals because the risk of detection and successful prosecution is kept low through the coercive control of their victims and the use of well-known money laundering methods. As a result, perpetrators may feel that they can benefit from the illicit proceeds and act with impunity. If you think back to the slides about how trafficking happens for both sex and labor, there is most often an initial grooming or recruitment period that takes place, where the trafficker is gaining the person's trust or selling them some sort of fraudulent dream. Intersections with the financial services industry can start in the recruitment phase before the trafficking operations have started and before the coercion or outright exploitation has occurred. In labor trafficking situations, victims may be coerced to pay illegal recruitment fees to their recruiters to guarantee their job in Canada. Many of these transactions are done using banks or money service businesses. Victims from impoverished backgrounds may take out predatory loans with extreme interest rates or sell family assets in order to pay for the very job that eventually entraps them in debt. Similarly, sex trafficking victims may pay recruitment fees for what they think are legitimate jobs at massage parlors or strip clubs, but can actually turn out to be jobs selling commercial sex. Another aspect of trafficking is coerced and fraudulent debt, which we'll spend a little bit more time on later on. But traffickers may take a victim's potential credit rating into account when they decide who to target and when they're in that recruiting phase, so that they are able to use the victim's credit to gain access to credit cards and bank accounts. And this can be an additional part of the business operations for some traffickers. As I've mentioned a few times, at its core, human trafficking is a profit-driven crime. It is often referred to as a high-reward, low-risk activity, and it's only really in the last 15 years that this issue has been getting the recognition that it requires. Financial services are used in organized as well as unorganized or one-off sex and labor trafficking operations. And each type and trafficker will have their own distinct ways of managing and also laundering the proceeds of the crime. Sex traffickers operating independently of an organized network or gang are more likely to utilize cryptocurrencies and prepaid credit cards to purchase commercial sex ads online and pay for the incidentals related to the cost of doing business. Traffickers may purchase virtual currencies directly via virtual currency exchanges, often using the money received from third parties via electronic money transfers, which have been directly derived from the trafficking activity. Traffickers frequently use nominees to funnel proceeds of crime, pay for trafficking costs, launder funds, and conceal the beneficial ownership of assets. These nominees can be the victims' accounts themselves. They can be family members and associates of the traffickers. Victim accounts may also be co-opted and used to funnel funds to the trafficker directly or to other victims. And in some instances, the victim and the trafficker may even have a joint account. Assets may also be placed in the name of family members or associates of the trafficker for protection, and often many of those hard costs associated with the trafficking are put in the victim's name. Canada's Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre, or FINTRAC, identified that nominees are usually the trafficker's parents and spouses, but can also be their siblings, adult and minor children. In recent years, very successful public-private partnerships have meant that the anti-money laundering community in Canada has really become a global leader in the tracking of illegal flows of money obtained through trafficking by implementing proactive transactional monitoring, by developing sophisticated AI-powered algorithms that monitor spending patterns and can shed light on the operational networks to better understand how money is being moved and who is in receipt of those funds. Collaboration between financial services, the federal regulator, and law enforcement has really opened up a very useful avenue to address the crime of trafficking in Canada and seize assets. Individuals working in banks, at money sending businesses, or even in casinos may be interacting with both victims and traffickers, and may be also interacting with the proceeds of this crime. And so they have an opportunity to be part of the solution. As we learned earlier, when it comes to labor trafficking, the natural focus should be on industries that employ large numbers of foreign nationals in low-wage work. These industries may rely on the services of third-party labor contractors rather than directly hiring workers. While I recognize that it is not fair to paint all employers with the same brush, to actually address the issue of labor trafficking, the systems of closed work permits and the inherently exploitative structure of Canada's guest worker programs are creating conditions that are allowing exploitation to flourish. Ontario, Quebec, British Columbia, and Alberta are the 4 provinces with the highest number of approved temporary foreign worker positions. The federal government releases data concerning approvals of the labor market impact assessments, which are required for employers to bring migrant workers into Canada. It also releases data on the industries in which migrant workers are being employed. The top 5 sending countries under the Federal Temporary Foreign Worker Program are Mexico, Guatemala, Jamaica, India, and the Philippines. Due to the fractured nature of the supply chain, particularly with the use of third-party labor contractors and international recruiters using different financial institutions, it can be difficult to link all parties associated with the trafficking pipeline. An earlier slide discussed the most at risk, being industries are those that regularly rely on guest worker programs, and industries that may be contracting out staffing responsibilities to unscrupulous agencies. Labor trafficking business models rely on all sectors of the financial industry, from business loans to payroll systems, as this form of exploitation is most likely taking place within a legal or legitimate industry, as compared to sex trafficking, which typically operates in a so-called gray market. For forced labor situations, some things to be mindful of are accounts that are opened that have a $0 balance, victims who are likely to be escorted to the bank or the money sending business to conduct the transfer or conduct their businesses, and traffickers may be listed on the account as well. There's also likely going to be some evidence of payroll activity, but workers might be paid, quote unquote, in cash, so the payroll entries may be incomplete. The person's earnings are not going to be in line with the hours that are worked, or there is infrequent payroll processing, suggesting that pay may being withheld to prevent employees from quitting, compared to the overall revenue generated by the business. Some traffickers may forego using payroll altogether and instead make direct deposits into the worker's bank account or onto prepaid cards. Like sex trafficking, transfer of funds from worker's account back to the employer's account at the end of the pay cycle that may be taking place is another indicator. One of the driving factors for labor migration is access to opportunity and income, and to provide for family back home. Many workers send money back home. The absence of remittance payments are not always a red flag of trafficking, but coupled with other indicators could be suspicious. On the other hand, traffickers may again accompany workers to financial institutions or money sending businesses to direct transfers of money to accounts outside of Canada. So the sending might look legitimate to front-facing employees. The sending might look legitimate, but front-facing employees may have the opportunity to spot aspects of the control and accompaniment. Consider including adverse media scans and reviewing employers sanctioned for the non-compliance by the federal government under the Temporary Foreign Worker Program. All of this information is publicly available. The majority of trafficking for sexual exploitation related to FINTRAC disclosures primarily concern victims providing sexual services at short stay locations, such as hotels. 2 other business models were also identified: exploitation at illicit storefront businesses offering sexual services, such as spas, massage parlors, and private clubs, and at private residences, so at apartments or homes, with some crossover between these categories. All of them used advertisement of escort services to obtain clients, and some traffickers operated their own escort agencies. Email money transfers and cash deposits were the primary transactions in sex trafficking disclosures from FINTRAC. FinTrack observed several money laundering methods in these disclosures. These included the use of online casinos, virtual currencies, prepaid cards, gift cards, nominees, front companies owned by traffickers and their associates, as well as funds layered between the related accounts and investment accounts. FinTrack also noted other forms of fraud that are occurring in conjunction with the trafficking activity, including organized identity fraud and drug trafficking. Of note, traffickers may coerce victims into the involvement in the money laundering scheme, the recruitment of new victims, and may direct them to engage in other forms of forced criminality and other fraudulent activity. By embedding the victim into the fraudulent scheme, traffickers are able to add an additional layer of control to keep their victims from reporting the situation. Traffickers are sophisticated. They are motivated, and this means that the crime is dynamic and that methods required to obscure the illicit activity are also adaptable. Traffickers are using technology to their advantage, and they are often highly organized. It's important to consider the entire trafficking and financial services ecosystem, as they are often interrelated and being exploited by traffickers. Some other types of transactions to look for include frequent accommodation and payment for hotels, Airbnbs, as well as payments to third-party hospitality booking websites. Frequent transportation charges for rental cars, parking fees, fuel charges, Ubers, highway tolls, bus, rail, and airfare, both domestic and international. Consider what is required for advertising, for the recruitment, and for the communication during trafficking operations. Charges associated with posting of job ads or sex ads, multiple cell phone bills, transfers for services rendered, money transfers from victims to traffickers and from traffickers to associates. Frequent charges for incidentals like food purchases, food delivery charges, pharmacy purchases, cosmetic enhancement charges are all things that you may see. Of note, many of these things on the surface are totally normal. There may be many similarities between a transaction indicative of human trafficking activity and legitimate transactions. And it should be noted that there's going to be some overlap between the transactions of trafficking and someone who is engaged in commercial sex work by choice. Context is incredibly important here. It's important to consider layering these types of transactional patterns with other information, such as other human trafficking indicators, other transactions, customer profile attributes, external open source data to determine if the activity is indeed suspicious. When thinking about the client profile, traffickers may have transactions indicating a lavish lifestyle that is inconsistent with the stated income, such as purchases at higher end restaurants, luxury clothing, accessories, retailers, luxury cars, jewelries, entertainment venues, gyms, fitness facilities, limousine companies, things like cosmetic surgery entities, and spas. Typically, these types of transactions were not observed amongst victims as their access to money and spending are tightly controlled by the trafficker. In the broader context of transactional patterns and behaviors, it's important to also consider what might be missing on a person's profile. What sort of normal things might be missing from the person's activity, such as rent or mortgage payments, student loan payments, dental appointments, extracurriculars and hobby purchases, gym memberships, monthly subscriptions to TV, etc. Coerced debt and financial fraud that is experienced by survivors of trafficking has only recently started to garner significant attention. As I've mentioned a number of times, traffickers are often forced victims to take out loans or put the trafficking related charges in their own names. This is to keep the paper trail of the trafficking activity at an arm's length from the trafficker. Alternatively, a trafficker may completely assume a victim's identity and access loans and lines of credit and other social benefits. Once the survivor has exited the trafficking situation, they are left with thousands of dollars in fraudulent or coerced debt, which can make it challenging to do things that we may take for granted, like rent an apartment, receive a student loan to go back to school, or even secure employment. The province of Ontario has passed Bill 41, which is legislation aimed at working with victims, social service agencies, and lenders to identify and remove the coerced debt and restore the survivor's credit standing. The government of Saskatchewan has also introduced similar, although not as ambitious, legislation which will assist survivors in navigating life after they have exited a trafficking situation. While this is a great start, there are certainly not enough supports for survivors post-exploitation to help them navigate the impact that trafficking has on their financial footprint. Earlier this year, Polaris, a US-based NGO who operate the US National Human Trafficking Hotline, released a report that was informed by the experience of survivors. And while this is a US report, we know that there are many similarities between the experiences of trafficking survivors in both Canada and the US. This report was focused on increasing opportunities for survivors of trafficking, but noted that 61% of those surveyed said the trafficker had accessed their bank accounts. 53% of survivors surveyed said that the trafficking related expenses were paid using a financial account that was theirs, and over half of those surveyed had their identity used for financial fraud. The resulting debt can make it nearly impossible to access mainstream financial systems and services, which leaves survivors at the mercy of expensive and often predatory loan options and payday lenders. At the lack of economic options, coupled with coerced debts and having missed important financial education during the formative years, can actually make someone more likely to consider going back to a trafficking situation, more likely to consider accepting unsafe work, and more likely to be targeted by another exploiter. This is why it's so important to shine a light on all aspects of the ways in which financial services interact with human trafficking, and impress upon you the very important role that financial services has in the healing and recovery stage of a survivor's journey. We know that access to financial services and resources can be one of the primary barriers to leaving a trafficker. But if there is access, it can also be a very important driver in leaving that situation. When survivors have the ability to rebuild their credit, access bank accounts, gain economic employment, find safe housing, and secure meaningful employment, that person's risk for re-exploitation drops dramatically. Providing access to these necessities for survivors of trafficking is an important aspect of prevention work. Financial crimes investigators can provide important evidence to support human trafficking investigations, arrests, and ultimately, hopefully, convictions. We know that the current judicial system is reliant on witness testimony. The court process can be overwhelming and stigmatizing, psychologically unsafe, and re-traumatizing for survivors of trafficking. Financial transaction data can help corroborate the testimony of survivors, along with other digital evidence. We together can start to ease that burden. For the last part of this section, I wanted to talk about sex trafficking specific money laundering indicators. Again, it's imperative to keep context and patterns in mind when you consider the following indicators. Think about accounts with multiple email addresses, phone numbers, physical addresses, multiple phone bills, accounts with multiple internet bills. Does the client email address also found on escort websites, or are their names associated with adverse media scans? Consider accounts with frequent cash deposits in cities where the customer doesn't reside or regularly conduct business. Frequent transactions that fall outside typical business hours. Again, context matters here. This alone is not suspicious. Frequent payments made to online escort, adult content, advertising services, online classifieds, or website hosting companies. Again, lavish lifestyle purchases outside of their means. Using off-label or white label ATMs for withdrawals. Frequent purchases and/or use of prepaid cards. Or sending it or receiving of funds via cryptocurrency, high volumes of purchases at stores known to sell prepaid cards like pharmacies. Peer-to-peer payments followed almost immediately by a withdrawal or transfer. frequent transaction cancellations and deposits below reporting thresholds, frequent car rentals within the city of residence, and frequent low value or abnormally high fast food spending. Finally, let's talk about the implications for businesses who either turn a blind eye to human trafficking or fail to ensure their businesses have taken the necessary steps to implement protocols when there are suspected human trafficking situations occurring. In the United States, there have been a number of high profile civil suits brought by survivors of trafficking against businesses which failed to intervene in human trafficking situations. Last year, a class action civil suit was brought against JP Chase, Morgan Chase by a victim of Jeffrey Epstein for ignoring internal warnings about Epstein's sexual abuse of young women, for continuing to work with and profit from having him as a client. Human trafficking incidents can bring the business negative publicity, which carries some reputational risk, can interrupt business operations, and can negatively impact the employee morale. In Canada, if you are a reporting entity and subject to the federal anti-money laundering regime, non-compliance and failure to report can lead to administrative penalties and criminal charges.